tell us how you got into crop circles.
How I got into crop circles, I was living in Guildford, south of London. Our Guildford Metaphysical Society used to drive out. My friends took me to see this new strange shapes that would appear in Wiltshire. It's a special place called Cheesefoot Head. And why would it appear there? And these circles appeared, and then the circles had a ring round. It was so magical. I think that was the late 80s, and it was an awesome new mystery, even better than UFOs, you know. And then around about early 90s, the crop circles actually came to Guildford, and the Hogs back, suddenly there they were, and there was a lunar crescent there, you know, and there was a triangle inside a circle, and you know, mathematical structures were appearing there, and I was a school math teacher, and I felt they were somehow talking to me. Or I was saying, well, I'm a scientist, of course, I'm not into all this stuff, and but somehow I got pulled into it that way.
How are the geese? Are we hearing
Yeah, what is that?
There's geese. The geese were.
They weren't too bad.
Okay. So we don't need to do that again, you don't think?
No, I don't think we have to.
Good. Okay. Next, I guess, can you tell us about people? When people look at the crop circle, they might not be aware of all the hidden geometry just beneath the surface. Can you lead us into that? The hidden geometry.
Right.
That the eye doesn't.
Well, I was very privileged in Guildford to be able to visit crop circles before other people had trampled them. That was an amazing thing when the crop circles came to Guildford. And you see this wonderful spiral pattern from the centre, or from somewhere near the centre. And the early ones in the early 90s were kind of wobbly and a bit biological. And the amazing thing was the crop was fanned out one way and then the other way on the circle around it. And then what happened in the mid-90s, they become much more structured. For example, early 90s they had all what we call grape shot, that's random bits of splattering of very small circles all around the main circle. And they were rather biological in appearance. And mid-90s they started looking as if someone had designed it all on a laptop or something and was somehow able to project it. Now, what I call hypermaths in my book is an inspiring new form of geometry which the circle makers are doing. Now, before that, in the early 90s, some pioneers had apprehended the beginning of beginning of maths in the circle patterns. John Martin showed various subtle tangent effects and intervals between the shapes, and then the astronomer Gerald Hawkins came out with his famous theory of diatonic ratios, which is about the sizes of circles. So if you've got different circles in formation, he would say you've got whole number ratios in the circle diameters according to a certain canon, which he said was musical. He called it diatonic, and that has to do with the ratio of church bells pealing, you know, that sort of thing. And it basically means squares, triangles, hexagons, but not pentagons. That sort of simple whole number ratios. Okay, now.
Mind if I interrupt you real quickly? Can I move you? I'm just move you down a little bit more for the eye line.
Sure.
Then try to look at Charlie as much as possible. Feel free to look around and things like that.
Right.
But try not to.
Right.
And when you're explaining things, I'm very interested in what you're saying.
Right.
But try not to look at me. Or,
Yeah.
Or Alex.
Yeah. I can hardly see you actually.
Yeah, I know,
that's okay.
it's hard to see him, but yeah.
Yeah.
That's all.
So one other note, try not to cut Charlie off because then the audio overlaps. So just like wait till Charlie's completely finished.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe wait a second, then
Yeah.
answer.
You're doing great, Nick. You're good.
Right. Now, in the mid-90s, this much more complex geometry started to appear of real designs and of forms of pattern that one hadn't really heard of before. And you could describe it as geometry with some sort of spiritual meaning to it. Because nowadays maths is for analysis and for utilitarian purposes of structure and design, okay? Now what the circle makers were doing seemed to take off from where Leonardo da Vinci and Giordano da Bruno left off. It was geometry, but that had some sort of inner meaning. And it's very difficult to put this in words. That geometry that grabs hold of people and inspires them And it doesn't start off with a ruler and pencil and angle. It starts off with the hole, the circle, and much more works inwards. So it's a geometry that the end product is a mandala, some sort of a design that conveys something to you, something that is not verbal. It grabs a hold of you, it has a meaning, and you can't easily say what that meaning is. So this started to come out in the mid-90s, and each year seemed to have a different theme to it, and each year they seemed to be able to do something a bit more complex. For example, ratios to do with 7 and 11 came in later on. A definite year they became able to do, here is sevenfold geometry, you know, here's 11, here's 13. So it was gradually unfolding.
Okay, so would you say there's definitely an evolution there, like almost a course, a math course that we're being...
Totally, yeah. In fact, I'm glad I wrote my book in 2002, because after that it became so much more complex, as if they could do things in a much more decorative and sort of obscure manner. It went through an evolution process, and what I call hypermath, a quite new geometry that unfolded, was roughly about mid-90s up till about early in the next century, that that whole thing unfolded. For example, this year, 2009, I would say there's been not a lot of things geometrical or mathematical as such. It's been a very biological year, wonderful organic forms of, you know, of the hummingbird and dragonfly, and this year the theme is not mathematical, you know.
Good. So let's get to the greatest hits now, and you can reference if you need a sec. Crooked Soli, which you mentioned.
Right, this is an example of something very, very complicated, and Alan Brown, the great crop circle geometer, and John Michell, a British philosopher, got together and wrote a book about it, and it involved a basic vesicle Pisces design that was rotated around about sort of 72 times. I think it was 18 replications each quarter, and so that formed a very complicated pattern of squares in a circular sort of arc, and then certain of those squares were pushed down to make a simple DNA-ish pattern that rotated round on itself. And Alan Brown waited a year before see what other people said about it. Nobody said much about it at all, because it was cut down almost as soon as it was formed. Only Steve Alexander managed to get a photo of it, thank goodness. And there was the number 5040, and the total number that John Michell felt had a deep significance. And so I did a reanalysis of it. I got a very good photo from Steve Alexander, because very much where the problem is getting the overhead photo. You get an angular photo, it's difficult to do the geometric reconstruction, because you really need something vertically overhead, right? So I looked at this vesicle Pisces type design, and that is certainly one of the most complicated things, astonishingly complicated, staggering complexity, really, in an almost casual way. It's out of the way field, hardly anyone noticed it, and yet only Alan Brown appreciated the deep complexity. Oddly enough, a year or so later, he was due to speak at Francine Blake's conference, and he had to be pulled out suddenly because it became discovered that he came to believe it was man-made, and for some reason, after writing this book. But I like to say that my book, I'm not concerned with that very dire judgment which everybody wants to make, is this man-made or not, right? I'm just encouraging people to stay with the geometry and get a feel, when you reconstruct geometry, get a feel for it, and what's it doing. It's not trying to give an answer, it's some holistic mandala that it's giving you. You feel it first, it's something you feel, and you can analyse it later, and that in itself is something maybe rather different from what you've previously experienced.
Great. Moving on to the swallows in 2003, August. Was that the first instance of birds, and what was so special about that?
Well, it gave a wonderful sense of birds in flight, that, and it wasn't until Bert Janssen, the Dutch geometer, in one of his published books, he described the geometric sequence, which you would hardly guess that it would come out of. Let me try to describe that. You have a circle, you have two with a vesica Pisces pattern in the middle, and out of that, two circles slightly overlapping, you get the wings of the swallow come out, and the tail. Okay. Now that then iterates. You get another half size. You then do a half size circle, touching the radius of your first center perimeter of your first circle. You do exactly the same thing again. You get another swallow half the size. You do another half size of that circle. You get another swallow a quarter of the size of your first one. So that is an infinite sequence. There's only one famous artist that we all know that delighted in that kind of geometry, and that's Escher, the Dutch artist Escher, right? He is the one artist you can say who is similar to the circle makers in the sense that he has mathematics in his bones, and he did art because of his enjoyment of mathematics. That's Escher, right? And that is where the circle makers are. Somehow they're not just using maths. Maths is in their bones, or in deep in their consciousness, in the way they create their art. So this astonishingly joyful picture of birds in flight actually comes out of an infinite geometric sequence of circles and vesica Pisces iterated, and they've just used the first three to get those swallows one behind the other, and it gives a nice family sense, a family of birds one behind the other, the smaller birds at the back. And then to get this wonderful sense of flight, you'll notice those bubbles put behind them, trailing behind, there's a slight curve to those. And I think that's important, and that actually isn't from the design at all. That's just the way the farmers' field lines in the wheat curved. Okay, just following the curves in the farmers' tracks, and I think that gives a wonderful sense. These birds wheeling around a bit, part of the sense of delight of that design.
Great. Okay, let's see. I'm really interested in this. We're getting into the Vitruvian Man, head-born worthy, 97, and the squaring of the circle, how the circle was first squared. You touched on that a little bit, but this formation is something that you focus on.
Oh, right. Well, with the squaring the circle makers give us several different attempts, as if they come at it from different angles. And this is when you put a circle having the same perimeter as the square. Okay, so it's 2 pi d gives you the sum of the four lengths, and they've got various ways of doing this. And Michael Glickman pointed this out. I think he deserves the credit for that. Alan Brown has got various things unpublished about, he reckons, different ways of squaring a circle with just the quintuplets. I'm not quite sure about that, because we don't have very exact proportions of the sizes of those various quintuplets. But Michael Glickman pointed out a couple of the circle squaring ones, and then Bert Janssen did more recently. So I think that they are grappling with that age-old question of this ratio. Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little more about that ratio? It's such a special one, the way that man seems to inherently have this magical ratio, built into his very bones, and then we see that reflected in the circles.
If I may, usually the symbolism of the circle makers is somewhat non-specific. You can give all sorts of other interpretations. Everyone can disagree, okay? But now we come to the fundamental pi perception, which is the core of this squaring of the circle, okay? And something happened last year, and let's look at this, because this is a design that has absolutely only one interpretation to it, okay? And Mike Reed, an American astrophysicist, was looking at this and suddenly twigged, wow, I think it's about the 5th of June, wow, that has to be pi, to 10 places, 10 figures. And at the same time, I believe it's more or less the same day in England, Karin Alexander looked at this design, and she didn't quite get it, but she said, oh, look, I wonder if that point there is a decimal point somehow. A decimal point. She thought the same day. So she rang up Michael Glickman, And when she rang up Michael Glickman and suggested that to him, Michael Glickman grasped that the whole thing was pi. So I think that's a very synchronous thing across the Atlantic of different people getting this. This is 3 point, and the shorter one is 1, then the long one is 4, and it just goes around like that. Now let's look at this wonderful way the circle makers have used 10 in 2 different ways. First of all, they divided up the circle into 10. That corresponds to the decimal system of number counting. There's 10 steps to go all the way around, okay? So you can signify any number between 1 and 10 just by your 10-fold division of the circle. Secondly, they've got 10 layers or 10 circles that go from inside to outside. So that's the inside one, that circle there, and the first layer is 3, and it goes on out to 10 steps, 10 figures. So each of those signifies pi, and then it ends up with these 3 blobs as if signifying that it's sort of going on forever. And the last of the 10 figure, they rounded up, which people are quite intrigued by that. So the last figure of their pi, the 10th figure, was rounded up to the closest decimal point value. And so this is the one that hit the papers last year, the fact that the circle makers had given to us pi, and they'd done it in a way that nobody ever thought of before. As so often with the circle makers, there is a sense of delight in doing this. So if you give this to any school kids, they will really enjoy it in a way that they won't with if you just tell them about pi. There's a visual imagination has been at work here, and these 3 dots here signify, as it were, infinity, something going on forever. I mean, you can go on with this, like people do. And Michael Glickman says, but Janssen said, yeah, that is the side of the square that corresponds to squaring of that big outer circle. And perhaps it does. Okay, perhaps it does. But in other words, that square would have the same perimeter length as this circumference. And then, but Janssen also showed that these divisions correspond to 7 circles going from inside to outside. So there's a deep, nice structure to it. So that was one of the masterpieces that really convey the squaring of the circle paradox.
Great. Let's move on to the pentagram of Venus. You could just start off and don't try and remember to start with the question of the pentagram of Venus.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
my work.
Yeah. It was about 1996 when the pentagram started to be expressed, and this meant that croppies had to start marking up on the golden ratio. Now, who was there who understood the golden ratio in those times? It wasn't in the school maths syllabus. We started getting powers of the golden ratio. And that happens when you get pentagrams expanding or nesting one into the other. The circle makers gave us the pentagram, but also one of their favourite tricks is a half-turn rotation. So they give you a pentagram design, then they give you a half-turn of that pentagram, and it's scaled up or down so that it just touches the other pentagram. And that is actually will be a golden ratio proportion, that scaling. So you've now got a tenfold pattern due to a half-turn rotation of your first pattern. And in these pentagram designs, we see another favourite thing that the circle makers use of enveloping out a pattern. Often a pentagon is the enveloping principle outside. It's a 5-sided figure which is outside your nested pentagrams. So the sense of delight in the way the circle makers use pentagrams and pentagons interlinked. And there's a marvellous way in which they are interlinked. And I asked myself, I was one of the people who had to start trying to figure out how the golden ratio works and so on in order to reconstruct these. And I can only think of 2 people, Robin Heath and John Martineau, in the mid-90s, who could do this stuff and who were talking about it and writing about it. And somehow, once it came into the public consciousness from these marvellous designs, we all had to learn about it. And also, you get to experience what I describe as the vibrant creative energy of the pentagram. pentagram. It doesn't replicate like the hexagon that you can put them next to each other, but you put them next to each other. They always have to be larger or smaller to try and fit together. And there's a very vibrant energy, I think, in the pentagon because of the way all its sides divide in golden ratio proportions. That I think could inspire our culture if we tried to use pentagram designs a bit more, get away from this dull, depressing dependence on squares and rectangles everywhere, and try to use some of this vibrant 5-fold and 10-fold geometry the circle makers are showing us.
Did you want to talk about, well, let's move on to the 2000 Silbury nested pentagrams. I think you covered that actually, you talked about how...
Yeah, the 2000 nested pentagrams, now that shows powers of the golden ratio up to the 4th power. And I was amazed at that, and Michael Littman counted the little triangles, 36-degree ones, 72 degrees 36, which is what the pentagram forms. He said there's about 36 of these in this pattern. So that's a terrific lot. And who could do these powers of the golden ratio? Because to construct those, you would really have to understand those powers of phi, the golden ratio, up to through 3rd and 4th powers. And it took me quite a few years not to understand it, but to get a geometry kit that could do it. That is what appeared at the turn of the millennium. Yeah, around Silbury Hill, these different designs with golden ratio powers in them.
Great. Moving on to the golden ratio, we're staying with the golden ratio. The golden spider web, you said that took you a while to crack. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, indeed. This appeared just outside Avebury. What year was it? 96 or so?
Just mention what it is.
The golden spider web, what was called the spider web, appeared just outside Avebury, right smack bang outside Avebury, Britain's chief lunar temple, and in around about 96. And various groups stepped forward to claim credit for it, okay? But oddly enough, nobody understood the marvellous double pentagram architecture of it until Gerald Hawkins revealed this a few years later, that you have a pentagram, and then inside it you do another pentagram, and that defines your innermost circle. And the spider web was actually a 10-fold pattern with a series of circles creating the web. So the web was a series of circles, circular arcs, and then they touch the central circle, the various central circles, they touch, okay? And so what is all that about? And just earlier this year, I managed to twig that this was a theorem, a wonderful theorem, whereby if you put 10 circles onto a surrounding one circle, what size must they be? And if you have, you make them a bit larger, so they just touch the inmost circle, which is in the same size as they are. That has certain geometric implications, and it's all about the golden ratio again. That is a golden web, and I became able to understand that earlier this year. I just put it up on my Hypermaths website. I felt that was very wonderful. I would have liked to discuss it with Gerald Hawkins if he was still around. He would really have appreciated that. I think there's an implicit maths and geometry in these formations that sometimes takes many years to understand for us to twig what's going on. That is about 11 years after it appeared that I got that about the real geometric meaning of that spider web. Yeah.
I think now might be a good time to actually explain to the audience what the golden ratio is as best you can.
Sure, yeah. Golden ratio, if you divide a line in two proportions, the larger to the smaller equals the larger to the whole. So it's a self-referencing proportion that is totally dynamic and is connected with the idea of perfection. If you look at Botticelli's Venus painting, then the navel of Venus is at the level of where the sea in Venus, and that is the golden ratio of the whole painting. Okay, so it has a sense of of pleasing proportion, and it's also connected with a particular triangle. You get in a pentagram, 36 degrees, which is a 1/10 division of the circle, and 72 at the bottom, and those sides will then be in the golden ratio. So those are two quite simple definitions of it. Yeah.
And is it true that we find the golden ratio in nature?
We find the Fibonacci series in nature, okay, and that gets closer and closer to the golden ratio, like 5 to 8, okay, 8 to 13 in the, say, a pineapple or whatever. That sequence, 3 to 5, that is the Fibonacci series, and those ratios get closer and closer to phi, the perfect golden ratio. They approximate to it, and Venus, in the ratios the planet Venus weaves out in the sky, that gives you phi proportions in terms of the period of the Venus year to the Earth year and so forth, and that has a weaves out a pentagram around the Earth. So Venus gives us phi based proportions to do with idea of beauty and perfection and harmony, that I think we need to try and appreciate.
You just mentioned Botticelli. Does it seem like artists and architects, creative folk in the past, the Greeks, the Egyptians, that they knew this?
Well, I wouldn't go that far back. I think just around the time of Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, the first textbook.
I'm so sorry. So sorry.
That's right.
We'll start again with Botticelli.
Yeah, fine.
Apologies.
Don't worry, that's right.
Charlie,
Okay.
Just be careful when you put your feet on the ground. It's very loose boards, so the vibrations travel.
Okay, sorry.
No.
Okay. Okay, in terms of how far back the golden ratio goes, I would say it's around the time of Botticelli and Leonardo. The first textbook was written about by this chap. The name Fibonacci appears then, and I would say Botticelli was consciously trying to use it, okay? Whereas I'm not convinced that it goes back that further. People say, oh, look at the Acropolis, hasn't that got phi in it? Well, I'm not so sure, actually. Or did Plato use it? Well, I rather doubt it, actually. I don't... Well, the name phi is to do with Phidias, the Greek sculpture, and people reckon that he had the golden ratio. Well, maybe he did. But I don't think there's anything Greek explicitly about phi. I think that it's a Renaissance phenomena that people began to figure out that wonderful proportion, and they used it in harmonious, for aesthetic purposes. That's what it seems to me, yeah. And the name only appeared in the 20th century. Phi, I think that was given in the 20th century for the golden ratio, yeah.
Thanks. Let's move on to fractals, the Silbury Hill, Cock, hexagon, and some of the other ones, and how that basically reinforced the Mandelbrot's work and came into the forefront.
Yeah, the wonderful Koch fractal pattern started happening around Silbury Hill, as if Silbury Hill was some sort of mother type influence that could kind of spawn these patterns around it with endless profusion. And so this is six-fold geometry, and number 6 is basically the idea of harmony, perfect harmony without stress or strife, okay? That's like the flower of life designs. And this Koch fractal is something that goes on forever, but circle makers only take it a certain degree of iterations. And they take that Koch fractal, and so you get that appearing in various ways. And the specific kind of signature or characteristic of circle maker art, you get a pattern within it, which is similar but different. So you've got the Koch pattern reflected inside it, as if the Koch pattern was turned the other way, so it went inside on a slightly smaller scale, and you got a Koch fractal type of effect within as well as without. And that is a characteristic of the grand circle maker masterpieces, that you get the within of the pattern reflecting the without in a way that is interrelated. So we saw that with the Koch patterns and the way they, yeah.
Great. You just raised something for me. Do you remember the Barbary Castle 91 formation and how that did exactly that? You had the circles were described describe each other and would describe the overall shape of that design.
Yeah. Well, that was somewhat before the period I'm dealing with. Okay, that was one that it sort of blew a lot of people's minds that it couldn't possibly be a natural formation, that Barbary castle, and it had 3 different types of a ratchet and a spiral and so on, and a lot of people thought, maybe this signifies something. I mean, I don't know what, but
fair enough. Yeah. Let's get to, well, we touched a little on Fibonacci numbers, but spirals. And we find spirals in the circles and in nature. The galaxy, for instance, is something you raised.
Yeah. Well, circumstances did wonderful logarithmic spirals. For example, there was the triple Julius spiral that appeared next door to Stonehenge at one point, and that was which Paul Vigay maps out, and that's a genuine logarithmic spiral. Okay, it has a formula for doing it, and it appeared 3 times, and they've done that in various different ways. They've used that logarithmic spiral, so that they're quite. Like, for example, there was a snail type one that appeared a few years ago. So they're quite capable of doing that. But one, perhaps the most famous, was one called the sunflower, which appeared, which was a pie type design because it had 14 layers divided in 22-fold or 44 around the circle. So it gave you the pi ratio. And everyone said, oh, this is the logarithmic spiral and Fibonacci ratios in it. And especially I noticed these hoaxers or human serial artists were claiming they'd made it and claiming you had the Fibonacci ratios in, and it didn't actually, because it wasn't a logarithmic spiral at all. It was what we call an Archimedes spiral, and that is purely arithmetic. There's no ratio or proportion in it. The ratios are exactly the same because each layer is the same thickness as you go out, so that the ratios, the spirals that come out are not geometric. An Archimedes spiral is like if you coil a rope around on the ground, right? Archimedes spiral has the advantage that you actually get to the centre, right? Archimedes spiral does get to the centre, whereas the logarithmic one never does, right? So that sunflower, it didn't have the centre; it was cut away, so you didn't see the spirals reaching the centre, okay? But it was that type of spiral. Very, very wonderfully done, in a way that leaves everyone sort of silent with awe, as these masterpieces usually do when you understand them. So there are 1 or 2 examples of it doing making the Archimedes spiral, which is non-logarithmic, and I think that's important to appreciate because. In terms of who's making them, that a lot of people didn't appreciate that sunflower one was Archimedes.
You've made this point several times. They're masterpieces. We've tried to contact the Tate several times to make the same point, and they're not interested. Why is the media? Why is mainstream kind of culture? Why do they not realise the craftsmanship that's going on here?
Well, that's a very deep question you asked me with far-reaching implications. Basically, as far as the media are concerned, the people have to live in fear and have to frighten the hell out of them the whole time, and they're not very responsive to good news. You can't easily put something, do with delight and wholeness, and on your front page or announce it without exposing it in some way. When the Doug and Dave story blossomed in '93, that got far more publicity than any of the ordinary lecturers on the circuit. Everyone loved the idea of how we hoaxed the world. The croppies kept waiting for Doug and Dave to provide any shred of evidence that they had or could make a circle, and that never really appeared. But just by making the claim, that is the story that the media want. They will give terrific publicity to someone, a couple or a group, just for making the claim. And I was interested in Lundgren's book. Lundgren, one of his team, right? He wrote a book recently, and it had no geometrical diagrams in it at all, except just black and white images of the formations, right? And the only bit of maths it had in it, was what I've already said to you, claiming that there were Fibonacci series in that sunflower design, which are not actually present, right? And if you go back to his website, the Circle Maker's website, which I did when I was writing my book, right, in 2002, he had various impressive looking diagrams on the front page, which, as Paul Vijay told me, were copied from him, his constructions, which obviously they weren't allowed to use in their book. And I think those tended to give it credibility. So I think that these people who claim to be making them aren't really interested in geometry or maths as such. From my point of view, what's important for me, I don't really think they have a lot of interest in maths. I mean, it's hard to generalise in this. I may be wrong, but I think they like the interaction with some sort of psychic type phenomena. But obviously it is very puzzling that it appears to be a rather small group interested in the formations. I mean, what can I say? I remember when they first appeared in Guildford, okay? This was back in '92. And I came out, I got a friend of mine to drive out, and there's a magnificent, Saturday afternoon, magnificent big circle in this wheat field, just outside Guildford, for God's sake. And I wondered, well, how come the people of Guildford don't come out to have a look at this, you know? Where are they all? Well, they're all just doing their shopping, you know? And I do find it puzzling that more people don't want to have the enjoyable experience of seeing this, yeah. As John Michel said, it's the best show in England.
Okay, let's go on to Everest, as you call it. Alton Barnes, 1998, heptagonal geometry, I believe.
Okay, way back in '98, the Circle Makers came out with their Grand Slam masterpieces with the heptagonal geometry, okay? They did two, which have been deeply analysed and reanalysed on various websites, and 7 or 14-fold geometry is very difficult to do, okay? The first one was unfortunately somewhat wind damaged, and secondly, various cameras didn't work when they flew over it. They just blacked out, and so we're very short of decent photographs of it. But it's sort of a tremendous fractal masterpiece. So arguments about whether it's fractal. Yes, it was. It was a heptagonal fractal, an iterative fractal pattern, from dividing a circle into 7, and then you have 7 circles, and you subdivide those into 7, and you then subdivide a third time all those circles into 7, and only a few of those come to the outside, so you see them. So you see altogether about 21 parts of circles around the outside. You see 3 of each of the so the second or third iteration you get to the outside, and then you have little dots around the very outermost ones, so that's it's a sort of cascading effect of heptagons, a cascade that had not remotely occurred to anyone before. And a fellow called Dolf Braat, a Dutch fellow, did a diagram, which is very much a key diagram. He then mysteriously died, immediately got back to Holland. But he left this diagram, which I think I've argued is a key to the proper analysis of this. But as well as analysing it, as I just described, with circles on circles, you can also analyse it with straight lines. That if you draw a heptagon star or a heptagon pattern, touching all the corners, you can get a pattern resembling it just from straight line constructions. So it has a remarkable depth and complexity that seems to contain all 3 heptagons. There's a heptagon from joining 7 points on a circle, there's a heptagon from joining alternate points on the circle, alternate heptagon, and then there's the star heptagon from joining every 3rd point on your circle. That gives you the lovely star heptagon, right? So that design seemed to embody all 3 of those heptagons. Now, the only geometry I've ever come across which seems to want to integrate together those different heptagons was something the Elizabethan Magus John Dee did when he was trying to commune with angels, and he had a scrying some sort of board which still exists, and he had the alternate heptagon drawn and the star heptagon within it. And that's the only time anyone seems to have wanted to do that before the Circle Makers did it. Okay? Now, after that one appeared, a month or so later, another one, equally very profound heptagon pattern appeared, which in a way it was an explanation of how the former one appeared. The former one was very inscrutable, and this biheptagon design had a heptagon pattern within itself, an outer heptagon and an inner heptagon, and you had to draw about 6 or 7 different heptagon patterns which were all interlinked in order to see how these patterns were related. There were some lines on the ground, tracer lines, which connected together the inner and the outer heptagon patterns. But as Bert Janssen pointed out, these lines were not sufficient to construct it. So you can't really call them construction lines. They were sufficient to indicate the manner in which the design was accomplished. So this is the circle maker. For some reason, they wish to link together inner and outer patterns. And they want to do this for number 7, a number traditionally do with divine and mystical connotations. Number 7 is not found in nature. Mother Nature does not divide a circle into 1/7 parts. Okay, so therefore it has somewhat non-natural and mystical meaning, and it's not at all easy to construct the 1/7 angle. Okay, that's no joke. In a field at night, how do you make a 1/7 part of a circle? Having 14-fold geometry, and I couldn't add that this second one was, both of them are quite enormous. The first one, let me say, estimated, I think somebody estimated about 11 tons of wheat went down for that first one, right? And the second one, you could see it was about 7 or 8 tractor lines across, how big it was. So it was huge, this one. So that they were both really quite huge, and gave a definitive statement of something which had never existed on Earth before at all. Nobody had ever done patterns like that before. Nobody ever had the idea of doing it, quite apart from how you do it. So that 7-fold sort of architecture, and arguably those two were the most complex geometry the circle makers have ever done, from one point of view, you could say that. It took me some years to get a geometry pattern that could do those more advanced designs. I've just recently put it on my website, yeah.
Kind of answered a question, Mike, because I was thinking to myself, as you're describing all these, how complex a lot of these shapes are, how do you do that in the middle of the night? I mean, it just blows my mind. How do you, for instance, you have to plot out the skeletal kind of formation that you talk about. You have to replicate these forms in a fractal kind of nature. That just doesn't seem possible when you have no ambient light, and you have to be careful. You're going to be discovered and perhaps shot by a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Does that,
Well, it does, yeah. But the argument that these are too complex for any human beings to make has some rather strange implications to it. I would say you'd need very expensive equipment, so precision laser positioning, and months of rehearsal for a team to be able to make that. And remember, you can't fall over in the middle of the night. If you fall over in the wheat, or do a line, you forget to do it. You can't rub it out, That is the thing. I especially noticed there's an early one you mentioned. I may come back to that swallow's flight design, right? If you see the circles you have to draw to make that swallow's construction, the sheer amount you have to rub out when you're finished. You rub out an enormous amount of those lines to get the finished swallow pattern. And this is what we call latent geometry. Latent geometry is what is hidden, as it were, behind the formation that you see. A whole lot of lines that if you're drawing them, if you're designing it, you have to rub out at the end. And in a field of wheat, obviously, you can't rub anything out, So yeah, there is that problem, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on.
And also, there's a question of the centre being forbidden. That biheptagon I was talking about, the centre was not on a tram line, I think you'll find. So access was denied to your centre, which is obviously all important for these huge constructions. Mm.
Let's move on to sound wave interference, that one. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I think there were several over a couple of years, weren't there, of as it were high frequency sound wave interference. That if you have two, as it were, tuning forks, and you move them apart, you'll get a resonant frequency at some distance apart. and that is the interference, and that will move if you move them with respect to your ear. You'll hear it growing louder and softer. So the radiant interference pattern is sort of directional, and the circle maker showed that with as it were, a series of lines where the wheat pattern has a whole lot of arcs that fade away and then come back again as you rotate, because of the two sets of concentric circles. Two sets are not centered; they're slightly moving apart, and there were several designs according to how far apart the centers were. So that was fairly explicitly talking about some sort of sound interference, wasn't it? Yeah.
Skyscrapers, that's another one that seems just like impossibly hard to do in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
The 8th of July, Uffington Formation.
Yeah, was that 2006? Yeah, that was the grand climax of that year, I think. Of a very special year, a lot of wonderful 3D-ish effects. And that was one of the most 3D-ish pictures that Sogmax give us. I mean, these skyscrapers are wham, they're coming out at you. And so you get this terrific 3D effect of the growth of skyscrapers, okay? And so symbolically, you might say there's three of them, and for me that's like ground zero being reconstructed in New York. The skyscrapers are coming back again. So the circle makers are looking on the positive side. Hey, look, these are being rebuilt, these skyscrapers. They're rebuilding, it's reappearing. As always, the circle makers are serene, positive, unruffled. They're not angry about anything. And they have this inner tranquility, which is no doubt necessary for mathematical insight. Okay, now, next thing you notice is that those skyscrapers are part of logarithmic curves. You see, each of the three cycles has a sequence of smaller skyscrapers that are shrinking. That gives you a nice rotation effect. So there's a logarithmic curve effect. Okay, now to construct the first lot of three skyscrapers, you have a circle divided into 24, and then you join up, by putting some lines joining them up, you get diamond patterns appearing in the three corners, and then it's quite complicated. You'll see it in the diagrams. You then do a slight rotation. I think it's a hexagon pattern within that 24-fold division. You have to do a slight rotation and a contraction, and that gives you the basis for your next set of skyscrapers, which are shrunk. And you keep doing that rotation and contraction that gives you your sequence of skyscrapers. And those the positions will trace out three logarithmic spirals. So it's because that logarithmic spiral signifies, as it were, organic growth, and that's what you see in that. So nobody's ever thought, who would that ever occur to, the idea of having skyscrapers repeating in an organic logarithmic curve? It's just way out of anything that would occur to you, for God's sake, especially the idea of doing it in a wheat field. And so for most of us, most people just see that and it's wow, it just comes jumping out at you. And hardly anyone, it takes you a while to look into the design of it and see a really very complex structure based on 24-fold division of the circle, and you then have to do a hexagon pattern to get the diamond patterns of the skyscrapers and rotate it and iterate that. It's a really complicated pattern, I'd say. And while you're doing that complicated pattern, all the perception of the 3D stuff vanishes. You don't get that. So it's like left and right brain. Your right brain just appreciates the force of the 3D pattern, and then your left brain can analyse it and look at this marvellous geometry going on, which has never occurred to anyone on Earth before.
Great. Let's talk about hypermath a little more, and how you said you think that this is new. This is really, you've mentioned that a few times, this is new geometry.
Yeah, I think that someone who's been a school math teacher, this is a way to bring delight into classrooms, that you'll find your class will stay together and cohere more. Why? Because smart kids have got maths they can really grapple with, and the kids who can't do maths easily can, as it were, colour it in. I know that sounds silly, but they can appreciate the design of it. The design, the aesthetic design, is just as important, in many ways much more important than the trigonometry of how you do it. trigonometry is how you construct the right angle triangle and you find what the angle is, and so forth. Let's emphasise that aesthetics is not in any way part of modern maths. Modern mathematicians don't create or envision things in terms of attractive diagrams. They rather look down at diagrams, and there isn't any tradition of maths being artistically creative in this way. There isn't a school of mathematicians that spills over into decorative art and how to do it. Okay, so what the circle method is doing is something that doesn't really otherwise exist in our modern world of decorative art that has an inner necessity to it. It's not just entertainment, has an inner necessity to it because it comes out of mathematical principles. That is to me the remarkable feature that we have in these. And also, some of the masterpieces the circle methods come out are very simple. There can be concepts that are just, for example, how to put a triangle and a square inside a circle, and how they fit together, and getting a very aesthetically simple design that they do. So the masterpieces aren't necessarily very, very complicated. So I think you can have mathematics teaching at different levels from these designs.
Thanks. Okay, here's a really tough question. Why are they using mathematics and geometry to express these artistic creations? What do you think it is they want us to grasp?
Well, they do it because it's, as it were, in their inner being. Mathematics is the only truly universal language. Different countries, and if you want to believe it's some other dimension, they've got it. The maths has to be the same if it's a three-dimensional world. So it's a universal language of communication. If we could say the message is non-verbal, whatever it is they're trying to say, they have got a message. Everyone agrees there is some sort of message in these formations, and the message is non-verbal. It's coming across to us, and because it's non-verbal, it's not intellectual. You don't say, "Oh, I don't believe that," or "Oh, yes, maybe I believe in that." It's something you feel that gets you there, and they somehow have this never-failing source of creativity. Each year they got some new theme, which you think, goodness sake, surely they must have run out by now. And there's some astonishing new theme comes along, and there's always a sense of delight in what they do. Now, I think that is why do they do it? I mean, I noticed during 2001, when there was the mad cow epidemic in Britain, or rather, cows were being burnt all over this country, and it was totally horrific and ghastly, and the public weren't allowed on footpaths and stuff. There's allegedly bugs around, and so it was a time of total horror. And the circle makers' patterns had this same tranquility and starry loveliness as ever. So I concluded from that, Mother Nature is not making these. This is not a product from nature. They're not expressing the anguish that Mother Nature is experiencing now as cows are being burnt all over the countryside. There's total tranquility in these formations, these very star-like patterns. So wherever they're coming from has some sort of serene core to it that has access to harmony. And the mathematics is holistic, it's not analytical. So somehow it comes out of the completeness of the circle and creates this holistic mandala that isn't the same as doing an analytical maths. It's a somewhat different approach. Yeah.
Great. Would you like to talk about the formations you picked out before we towards the end of it?
Yeah. Okay.
You don't. How are they looking? How does that look?
The picture was good. These might be
They're
they're
shiny.
loose and they shine a lot.
Yeah.
We'll have pictures of these, right?
We
So
will absolutely.
We'll have photos
Okay.
so we can put away.
So I don't need to have this in front of me at all.
No, just
only for your own
Oh right.
peace of mind.
Oh right.
Yeah.
How can I do this? Okay. Right. 95. Right. Let's. The circle makers have remarkable astronomical images they give us, and none more so than what was called the asteroid belt of 95. And this depicted the 4 inner planets of the solar system, right? Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Earth, and the asteroids around the outside. First of all, the relative sizes were very precise and accurate of those orbital values.
Can you restart and you will just keep the same eye line.
Oh, right, okay.
We'll cut away, but
Right, yeah,
I'll definitely work better. Yeah.
yeah. So we do it again.
Yeah. Just,
That was really
Okay,
good.
okay.
Great. Yeah. Just describe it to Charlie.
Okay. Circle makers come out with remarkable astronomical images in a sort of rather sort of biological, holistic manner. In perhaps a slightly childlike vision they sometimes come out with, but none more remarkable than the asteroid belt of 1995, which depicted the 4 inner planets, Mars, Mercury, Earth and Venus. And for a start, it showed the relative sizes of the orbits very, very accurately. And you could see that Earth had a fairly perfectly circular orbit, so did Venus, whereas Mars and Mercury are quite elliptical. Okay? And the question is, what time? A big question everyone. What time? What date was the signifier? Because you had the positions of the planets, right? Not Earth. Earth wasn't there. And some people said, "Is this 2012?" You know, usual stuff. And I endorse what someone else had argued, that it was actually the time of the formation that they were showing. And my reasoning involved the great eccentricity of Mercury's orbit, and that tells you where the eccentricity doesn't change, that ellipticity, where it's pointing to in the zodiac, right? So that gives you a way of saying where the zodiac is, that eccentricity of Mercury's orbit, inmost one to the Sun. And from that you can tell the positions of Mercury, Venus and Mars in the zodiac. And that was my means of getting the time. I found them relatively accurate of where the positions were. And based on that, it was June 95 when it appeared. I said that is the zodiac was the way you'd see it directly in the southern sky, looking in the southern sky, which way around it was. And I felt that was an experiential account of where the planets were just at the formation. Okay, so that is quite a lot of information in some flattened wheat. You know, the eccentricity of the orbits, the perihelion of Mercury, relative positions of the planets, the position of the asteroid belt. That was a hell of a lot of astronomical information in some graphs. Yeah.
We'll move on to the others.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now, there's one I call binary fission of 2001, which showed a marvellous way of constructing a straight line out of circles. Okay, you start with a circle and divide it in two circles. Then you subdivide that into 2. You subdivide it into 2. You subdivide it into 2. And I call it 2 to the 5th because the powers of 2 keep increasing up to the 5th power, and you got, I think it was 32 tiny little circles all in a straight line. And the laid corn was the alternate powers of 2 had the corn laid down. Okay, so it went up to the 5th power of 2 by this bifurcation method, getting this marvellous straight line. So I had the concept of infinity, that as the powers of 2 go up, you get a more and more of a straight line. The circles gradually merge into a straight line. And I thought that was a wonderful expression of the idea of what the circle makers were up to, you know. Okay, last one. If you want this.
Yep.
Okay, this is in 2000. What I call a vertigo wheel appeared, where 12 circles were put around a big circle, and each circle, you started off a very small one, very big one at the other end, and they went up in a proportion, and that proportion itself kept increasing. So each circle was in proportion bigger to the next one by an increasing proportion. So it was I found for each diameter, it's the logarithm of the logarithm that stayed constant with this increase. It was I call it accelerated ratio. It wasn't that each circle was a certain fraction bigger than the one before, and that gave a more dynamic feel to it. So he went up the biggest circle and then came down again. Now, fitting those all touching onto a single circle is quite a major challenge. Okay, I would say it's a university level maths problem, that. And then, as well as doing that, they more or less got an outer circle and an inner circle around that, more or less, touching. And they didn't quite all fit, but more or less it was as if there were surrounding circles. And then they put the whole thing reflected and shrunk inside. So astonishing, they could just take the whole thing, shrink it and reflect it, and put it inside to counterbalance it. So the whole thing had a marvellous balance to it. So that had a vertigo sense of something accelerating and slowing down.
Very cool. I want to ask you about this season. You mentioned we're having a lot of biological forms. Can you comment on that? Do you have a theory, or can you?
I haven't got a theory. No. It's just that it's just the quality of what happens this year. There's a lot of dreamlike fantasy in the way that sort of cosmic graffiti that appear, and people ask, what does it mean? And it's just what it is. It's just some dreamlike fantasy pattern. So they had the swallow. They turned up with a swallow again instead of the three, just one, with a whole lot of strange graffiti pouring out from the end of it. It's just some strange fantasy art, I think, that we're getting. And it's like it's saying that it doesn't want the fixed geometry that it had on previous years. This is lovely biological patterns. For example, the dragonfly, you can see the marvellous ratios of the circles that build up the dragonfly, okay? And then there's marvellous circles containing it. But then on the gossamer wings of the dragonfly are sort of irregular lines which just wander around, giving the marvellous texture of those thin wings to make up that great masterpiece, which is that dragonfly this year.
Thank you. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to add? Things that we haven't really covered that you think are really important in terms of geometry?
Well, I think there's an open challenge for us that we're meant to do something with this geometry. And what? I think it's meant to come into our civilization so we can have fun a bit more and not be boxed in by squares and rectangles. I think if, for example, pop groups could experiment with having behind them some of these vibrant geometries, going through the sequences of the geometries that we get in these patterns, perhaps with different colours, and move through the patterns with different colours. I think that would inspire people. I think that the geometries have a meaning. We haven't got words to describe the meaning. That's one reason why the thing can be marginalised, but it does have meaning that's very important for us. And I would like to see, for example, town designs. I remember when I went to Chartres Cathedral, I felt the masterly touch lay in not using the right angles, all the marvellous designs that didn't have right angles. And I think we need to try and get back to that. We can get back to it in modern architecture. We don't have to have the right angles. And there's a whole lot of the geometries the circle is giving us which could bring delight into our world. And sort of maybe some unusual sense of something being different, to break away from the stereotype pattern.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can just direct the answers back to Charlie.
Yeah.
My question, I guess, would be, you touched upon cathedrals. Do you think that this geometry we're seeing is possibly ancient geometry that's resurfacing? So you just direct that question back to Charlie.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the Flower of Life is found at the Abydos temple in ancient Egypt on the wall, right? So that's a simple, concrete answer. That 1,000 years ago, people did do the Flower of Life for whatever reason, and the circle makers certainly delight in that six-fold Flower of Life pattern. Okay, but having said that, in general, I feel that the hexagon and the sevenfold, the pentagram patterns are not really found in ancient geometries, and that there's something genuinely new. I'm a science historian, so I spend a fair bit of time looking at ancient designs and stuff, and I really don't think these are from ancient times. I think these are totally new, and they show real creativity. And what we mean by creativity is something coming to existence which wasn't there before. So our world changes once these things are there, and they weren't there before. We have patterns of geometry that are innovative and not there in antiquity. Okay, and I think that's a kind of responsibility to try and do something with it. There may be some inspirational way that we can use this.
I also have a question about your feelings regarding geometry of stone circles, and do you think that in a landscape that's dotted with these geometric shapes and stones and even culture, that's the reason why maybe these crop circles are here in England?
Okay, now come to the question of whether the stone circles in England have anything to do with the fact that the phenomenon is primarily British. This is a very deep question, beyond my capacity to answer, but they did start in that tremendously important straight line between Avebury and Stonehenge, which are very much north-south of each other. That's where it began, as if that line had some sort of power to it. And initially, the formations were all within, I think they were within a 50-mile radius of Stonehenge. So plainly that was so. And then in Germany, I'm told that where they appear in Germany is often where ancient temple sites have existed. That's what I was told. And I think there is something to do with the ancient sites of Britain. I think there's a tremendous contrast between modern Brits, who are very cynical and pessimistic and materialistic and tend not to believe anything much, and these ancient power sites of Britain, which are somehow very inspirational for the phenomenon. Somehow the phenomenon is linked in with ancient stone temple designs, and I mean the fact that the stone circles are circles, that's a very British thing. There aren't loads of other countries with stone circles. The stones in Karnak, in Brittany, are not circles, they're rows of lines. So there's something about this country being completely littered with stone circles that must be relevant, mustn't it? Somehow. How? Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at Stonehenge, that's various concentric circles, and some people think that geometric patterns link together the outermost. For example, people suggest that the outermost Aubrey circle, you draw a star heptagon, and that defines the Sarsen circle in the middle, the relative size, okay? And that works fairly well, okay? Some people think that's... is that relevant to the circles appearing? Well, who can say, maybe in a general sort of way, there must be some sort of connection there, yeah.
Regarding the difficulty of people physically making these. You've expressed the idea of using, if you were to lay this out, you'd have to kind of do geometry that you'd have to erase later, but can you maybe lay out
Yeah, well, my approach is... I'm sorry, I mustn't do that. No, you finish talking.
Really fine, just lay out many difficulties, list out many difficulties one would have making...
Yeah, sure. As regards... who makes them? I'm not primarily concerned with that, right? My approach is mathematical, but obviously when there's terrific geometry, I stand at the edge, at the corner. If there are huge triangles, I go to the corner of that triangle on the outside and look at it. And there would have to be a hole where you stand a pole there. There'd have to be marks where feet stood, and you'd have to really hold that pole with taut ropes, making the big pentagon or triangle or whatever it was you were designing. And they're simply not there. You just see smoothly flowing wheat. There's no trace of a hole at the strategic point where it would have to be. Okay, that's one thing you notice. Another thing, times, especially around Guildford, when I got there, when no one else had been there, it would say it was raining the night before. You get there the next morning, and there are no muddy footprints. Now that's very important. If it's been raining all night and there are no muddy footprints, and somebody as a witness that it wasn't there the night before. That's quite a special, important experience that kind of happened to me early on. That was, I think, quite formative. I think there's no substitute for being in a circle when more or less no one else has got there before the wheat has been broken by trampling, and you see the different angles of lay of the wheat. For example, the way it fans out, it's actually an Archimedes spiral, General Hawkins explained to me, from that central point. And the wheat is only broken at one point. It's broken right near the centre because the curve is sufficiently sharp near the centre. That actually breaks the wheat and bends it. Otherwise, the wheat is always laid without being broken. And it's only at the very centre where the spiral is very sharp, a very steep spiral, that actually breaks the wheat. I think that's a very important experience to have and to see that. And sometimes you get different layers. You get one layer of wheat put down, say for a primary design, and then you get another white layer of wheat on top of it going in a different direction. And then another year, for example, when the wheat formation doesn't look very definite, it looks a bit blurred, you wonder what's going on here, and you go to it. This was just by Silbury Hill one year, and the wheat is only broken halfway up. The wheat goes up a normal way and then breaks halfway up, and that so the phenomenon is interacting with you. They're saying, okay, you lot, you believe it's man-made with planks. What about this? So you get wheat broken halfway up. Now that does have this advantage that as soon as people start walking in it, it's a complete mess, because wheat broken halfway up will obviously turn into a total mess once people start walking on it. Okay, but that is the phenomenon interacts with us all the time, and that is one example of it. I mean, I could comment further on the general problem of having teams where you never see them practicing. You never see them make a mistake. They don't need to rub anything out. And in the early morning mist, there's all these croppies up on the hill. They're waiting for the early morning mist to clear, and they don't see teams of circle makers rushing off. They don't see that. They really don't. And they're out there now looking for just that in the early morning. In the summer, a summer night doesn't last that long. It really doesn't. Especially people with infrared cameras out there right now, so these are remarkably invisible, these teams, if they're there. Yeah.
Can you comment about how you do have these extremely intricate designs, and that sometimes because of the incline of the hill, they're offset so that when you see them from above, they appear centered, but when you walk in, they're actually not.
Yeah, I remember the 777 one, 7th July 2007, where the guy, he did have this terrific camera set up with infrared and stuff, and he got to see them forming within a half an hour or so of them forming, and that was said of them, that there was a particular curves which were designed to, as if they came from above, that because of the curve of the hill, you couldn't see over the hill where the design went, I can't tell you an awful lot about this because we don't have a lot of data on this sort of thing. It would be nice if there was somebody out of grants to investigate this phenomenon properly, and then we'd have proper data on this totally important question of how a sloping hillside affects the formation. I mean, when Japanese teams come over, they're incredulous that there's no government grant whatever to investigate this phenomenon in a systematic and proper manner. Quite the contrary, any government grant is liable to try to fabricate the phenomena or create tricks to throw people off. Yeah.
And then finally, can you talk about what, if it's not trying to push you into a corner here and make any kind of definitive statement, but let's say it's not boards, what kind of mechanical or energetic effect could create these?
Well, I sometimes feel as if there's some future technology might be expressed in these designs. I mean, I was in my youth, I studied Rudolf Steiner's stuff, idea of etheric energy, and that seems to me much the same as what Wilhelm Reich talked about with orgone energy. And I believe that there's some sort of organic type effect that affects the wheat very much from inside, which is the way it can be bent. And especially the oilseed rape can be bent, which you or I could not bend at all. It would break if we tried to break it. We tried to bend it. So it's something effect that somehow works from within of the wheat, and you see the exploded wheat nodes as if some heat or whatever had worked on them. So it's some biological type energy, and I'd also like to. My general impression is that it's something fairly new, that from the 80s or 70s. And my general impression is, I may be wrong, that earlier accounts in previous centuries, you occasionally get flattened wheat, but there's different types of phenomena associated, like the grass is scorched or something, that you don't get now. So I feel it's. I don't accept the view that it goes back for centuries. I'm rather doubtful about that. It seems to me fairly new that people actually started talking about this in the 1980s. And once they started talking about it, then a few people started reminiscing about it. I said, oh yes, I saw that later, I remember it earlier. But you don't get people talking about it. I don't think what people talk about may not be quite the same thing, or flattened wheat with very clear boundaries. It's as if some energy is able to work. And to start with, the energy, as I say, was quite biological. Everything had a nice wobbly. If you like, for example, the Mandelbrot, right, in '93, we can say it's a geometrical shape, but actually it was very asymmetrical, and the things weren't the same size that should have been. They only acquired the ability to get this symmetry in the late 90s. So the force is a force that's gradually getting a hold of, coming into focus. Yeah. The question is, can I say anything about what proportion of people are hoaxing it, and if so, why they're doing it? This is way beyond my competence, but also let's remember that I talk about the formations that are well known and get onto the websites and get photographed, and a lot of photographers, I was talking to one, won't do them if they think they're hoaxed. If it's obviously some kids messing around, they won't reproduce it. Okay, so there's a filtering process that gets going. The ones that we see pictures of have been selected to weed out ones that may be man-made. Now the hoaxers don't think they're hoaxers; they think they're serial artists. Okay, comes as serial artists, and I mean, there's a lot of people who really, really believe that the big Aztec Mayan one a few years ago, one with sort of pair of sort of wing type figures was man-made over 2 nights, and that would have been a tremendous achievement if it was. I was talking with Charles in this cafe, and he says there's no doubt about that, and he claims that the blueprint for it was seen by people beforehand. Well, as usual, that blueprint, if it did exist, suddenly it becomes totally lost, and nobody knows where it is. You never get real evidence that is in the public domain for circumventing. All they have to do would be to give a photograph of the circle of the wheat field the night before they made it, or an infrared photograph of them making it, or put out in the public domain what it is they're going to make before they make it. Now, they might say in defence, oh, we haven't paid the farmer to do this, we're not allowed to do it, so therefore we can't go public. So that's a kind of circular argument that keeps it all sort of closed up. I mean, I think there's only about one case where the guy gave the data of what he was going to make before he made it. And then Michael Glickman reported him to the police, and so that's a story in itself. But in general, claims that, like Peter Sorensen claims to know teams of hoaxers, right? But he'll never tell you enough. I asked him, I said, Peter, look, just tell me, all the ones you've published, years and years, tell me one well-known one which was hoaxed, you know, of all the ones you published over the years. And basically, he couldn't. He couldn't give me a clear answer for anyone that any of us would have heard of that he could show was hoaxed. and you keep waiting for this evidence, and so I think there are hoaxes, but I rather doubt they do anything very much that's very significant. I may be wrong, and please don't regard me as an expert, but I think that there are teams out there, but I'm not clear that they do anything terribly significant. But as I say, I may be quite wrong on this.
Peter actually claims to have made the pie circle, Barbary Castle. Can you comment about that?
Well, I don't know that I want to, really. I think people get a terrific ego boost from making these claims, and often they get fame, and they don't have to deliver the goods at all. They just have to step forward and say, "Oh, we made that. Oh, great. Oh, did you? How clever." And they don't have to give any prediction or explanation of it. I mean, if Sorensen's claiming to have made the pie formation, did he tell anyone? Has he got a sealed letter that he gave to anyone before that can then be opened? I mean, if you had an idea of total genius like that had not occurred to the human race before, what is most remarkable about that formation isn't doing it on the ground, it's having the idea. In all the millennia of human history, nobody's ever expressed pi in terms of dividing up a tenfold cake like that before. So the idea is the most remarkable thing. And he would have drawn that out and given it to people to seal and open it if he'd done it, for God's sake. So I think we have to demand a modicum of evidence.
Thank you.
And you research these circles and the mathematics within them. Do you think that hoaxers are I mean, never mind. That's kind of a one-sided question. Just how do they affect you in a way that did they ever make you? Because they kind of cloud the waters. Do they not, or am I wrong?
Well, I think maybe I should do a review of John Lundgren's book, which it wouldn't be much to say about it. Something like Totally Clueless. I mean, they are Team Satan, and I think there is evidence of what they've done and how they took 2 nights with a whole lot of searchlights to illuminate them to make a fairly modest formation. I do agree that human serial artists have valuable contribution in terms of showing what can be done and how hard it is to do it and how long it takes to do it. I think that is the value. And Rupert Sheldrake once had a contest in which he invited a whole lot of people to try and simulate the phenomenon. And I asked him in his opinion if they could, and he said yes, he thought they could. Well, I don't agree with that. I think the judgment of the people when those formations were made in this competition, they couldn't actually get quite the swirling which the phenomenon actually produced. But Rupert Sheldrake's a good example of a very eminent British philosopher who thinks that humans can duplicate the phenomena, and a lot of people tend to believe that, yeah.
Unless Charlie has anything else, I guess I'm going to end this on a non-hoaxer question. If you want to direct this towards Charlie, what do you see in the future of where do you think this is going to go, or what's your predictions? I mean, it's obviously a wild ride the whole time, but do you have any final thoughts on just the phenomenon?
I don't want to make any predictions, no, certainly not. Just my prediction is that whatever happens will be unexpected. The circumstances each year you think they must be finished. You think, for goodness sake, surely they've said everything by now. What more can there possibly be to do? And the circumstances operate from an unfathomed source of creativity. You always think, oh, are they just going to go away? Is that it? Isn't that over now? Isn't the show over now? And no, the show is not over, actually. Here they are. They're here. There's some sort of reassurance we get in a world gone mad, in a crazy world gone mad. Somehow the circle makers preserve the integrity of their wonderful, holistic and harmonious patterns, and somehow they can keep doing this. And I think a lot of people, especially in the frightening nature of the modern world, derive reassurance from the stability and inner harmony from which the circle makers create. I deserve a beer after that, don't I?